What is your worst experience with bad neighbors?
I got along fine with my neighbors for 3 years. A mother and her adult son. They were both nice. But the son was very quiet. Sometimes he'd say hey and other times he didn't seem to recognize me. I assumed he was a recovering addict and didn't want to intrude. What ended up catching me though was when I listed the house for sale and found a family who was excited to make an offer. They were coming for their third tour so they could show it to their extended family. Apparently during this tour, the son scaled onto my patio, which is a feat in itself, and pounded on the back door and windows screaming at them to get out. He managed to break one of the windows before they cleared the property and called the police. When they contacted me, I learned he was schizophrenic and had a considerable history of violent outbursts, including attempting to stab family members. Apparently he thought I had stolen the house from its rightful owner and was trying to sell it behind their back. To his credit though, he referred to me as a bodybuilder, which I didn't hate. The family decided not to make an offer and I ended up having to pull it from the market. We rented a house that had another apartment in the basement. The lady who lived below us kept to herself for the most part, so we didn't see her much. Part of our rental was a detached garage and she asked if she could put small deep freezer in our garage. We were using it for storage, so we were fine with it. After a couple weeks of having her freezer in there, it somehow got unplugged and she came unglued on us and wanted us to pay to replace everything. I understood her frustration, but we hardly ever went into the garage since it was only for storage. In other words, we definitely didn't unplug it and our landlord agreed. But she was pissed. She had a son in college who came home for the summer. During that summer he found a cat and brought it home. His mom said no cats inside, so he would feed the kitten outside. She was pretty wild. He left for school again in the fall and we noticed that the cat was getting very thin. We started feeding her outside in her usual spot. Around Christmas we bought a bag of cat food and I made a plate of cookies and left them both at our neighbor's front door. The next day they were both back on our porch. Rude. Whatever. We continued to feed the cat because she obviously wasn't feeding her. A few weeks later the cat came to our door crying. She was trying to come inside. Super weird considering she was pretty wild and we had never let her inside before. I let her in and noticed she was pregnant and for sure about to have babies. I made her a little corner and she had babies the next day. We let her stay in the house with us, but we knew we couldn't keep her. I went downstairs to talk to our neighbor. She said that her son's cat was a boy, so the cat we had obviously wasn't his. I posted on Facebook to see if anyone was interested in fostering a cat and her kittens because we couldn't keep her. Her son saw my post on Facebook and got super mad at his mom. She then called the cops and said that I stole her cat and lied to her when she confronted me about having the cat in my possession. It was the stupidest, most frustrating thing that had ever happened to me as far as neighbors go. They were crackheads. They had 2 kids, were physically and verbally abusive to each other and were hoarders on top of it. Called Child Protective Services and the police over and over and was never taken seriously. They ended up burning down their apartment and caused thousands of dollars in damage to the rest of the apartment building because they were cooking meth. We had to move out, as did many others. The silver lining is that they finally got their kids taken away after that. Apartment building. The upstairs neighbor's dog peed on their patio and it dripped down onto me. While I was sitting outside reading, I yelled and ran to shower, and when I texted them to ask them to take their dog out to pee in future, they said it wasn't their dog and it must have blown over from somewhere else. What? I've posted this before. Our neighbor was tossing bags of her vomit into my yard for about a year. Like 50 bags. Called the cops. Turns out she had an eating disorder she was hiding from her parents. Edit. Seems like I sparked a bit of a eating disorder group therapy. Having witnessed just how far someone will go to hide their disorder. I hope this post and my past story can help one person get help before they go this far. Be strong. Be better. Dude pretended to be a reverend but was actually just a filthy fucking hoarder. He insisted on wearing sandals all of the time. And whenever he left his flat, the entire stairwell would stink of century-old unwashed feet. Eventually, the beetles that had infested his flat crawled up and into our kitchen and then everywhere. Took months to get him evicted. Fuck that guy. We had some neighbors that used to leave their garbage out in plastic bags the night before garbage day, instead of putting it in a bin. Around here, that's just ringing the dinner bell for raccoons and other critters. Sure enough, come morning there's garbage strewn all over the neighborhood. What the raccoons and skunks didn't spread around. The wind picked up the slack. Some of the people on the street kindly approached the guy and asked him to put his garbage in a bin. He told them to go fuck themselves. Thus began the garbage wars. Every morning of garbage day, some people on my street would collect all the half-eaten and rotten trash from their lawns and toss it back into the dude's backyard. He would collect it, then dump it back on their lawns, or cram it into their bushes. People started finding half-eaten burritos and candy wrappers in their mailboxes. The street started to look like a slum. Police were called. Health inspectors. City by law enforcement. Each side was calling in whatever authority they could muster to get their enemy in shit. The dude and his family. Amazingly, his wife seemed perfectly pleasant. Lasted about 8 months, then moved. Every once in a while I find a random margarine lid or piece of styrofoam in my hedge. And my mind goes back to those dark days of war. Edit. Spelling. My mom has a neighbor who literally looks through her window to try to see into the house. She's had to call the cops on her multiple times. I used to live in a horrible apartment with paper-thin walls. The people next door were a woman who looked like she was in her 70s and what I thought was her 30-something grandson. They would yell at each other all day, constantly blast their TV, and the smell of their cigarette smoke would waft through into my apartment and make the place absolutely reek. The worst was at night when the two of them would have loud sex. Which is how I figured out they weren't related. Every night for an hour, creaking bed banging against my bedroom wall and the old woman moaning like a stuck pig. Nightmarish. I also think the guy kept track of my schedule and watched for me because whenever I came home or went out, even when I took out the garbage, he would be there outside his place, trying to chit-chat with me while staring at my body and being completely gross. Lived there a year, but it felt like 10. My neighbors create this toxic smoke out of their chimney. We suspect that they are making drugs. I lived in an apartment with slot of rotating tenants. An elderly lady moved in across the hall from me, promptly started hoarding. I started to figure it out when her deck, porch started to fill up with odds and ends furniture, including but not limited to a roll-top desk. She also yelled at me once for taking her key out of the front door and putting it in the mail slot. Anyway, after a couple of weeks I started to realize I hadn't seen her in a while and started to smell something real weird. Turns out she had died and no one knew about it for a week, hence the smell. Her family came and cleared out all her stuff about a week after that. This is Wisconsin in the winter and I had my good Doc Marten work boots outside my door because they were wet. They used one of my boots to prop open their door while they moved out and then stole them when they were done. He lived in the apartment right below my husband and I. It went from constant complaints to him calling the cops on us multiple times to him leaving threatening message on our car and front door. When we first moved in, he was upset with the landlord for renting above him. Left plenty of unpleasant notes and interrupted quite a few times when we were talking to the landlord. When we moved in, we only had a mattress and no other furniture, but he kept calling the landlord, saying that we were moving furniture around at 2 a.m. and had our TV at full blast. After the 8th complaint in 2 months of us still moving around furniture and TV being too loud, we finally showed our apartment to the landlord. We literally didn't have a TV and still only had out mattress. Then the neighbor started leaving notes on our car telling us to keep it down, and he even put in writing, "There needs to be no noise after 10 p.m. or else I'll call the cops." We usually didn't even get home until after 11 p.m. and we were respectful to make sure we kept things down because we knew that not everyone had our work schedule. So we tried keeping it down even more, and there were so many instances when we'd be eating dinner or cuddling quietly or even sleeping and he'd be banging on his ceiling, our floor. After a few months he started calling the cops, and it got to the point where even the cops told him to stop calling about a noise complaint because it's a landlord issue, and every time they came they never heard anything. The last time they showed up I was asleep and my husband ended up talking to them and explaining everything. They suggested that we file a harassment complaint. Then the cops showed up at the coffee shop I worked at the time and explained that they were getting almost nightly calls, and they suggested to me too that we should file a harassment complaint against the neighbor. Then he started leaving threatening notes on our car and front door, and we kept hearing our doorknob jiggle. He claimed that he and a friend had sat outside our apartment for 2 hours and listened to all the noise we were making. He's a retired cop and will call in a few favors if we continue making noise. He knows where we park our car, so we better start parking it somewhere else if we didn't want it to get damaged. Etc. We kept the notes and made copies for the landlord and let him know that this was what we were dealing with, so we're just keeping him in the loop before shit started getting real, aka we're tired of this, and if an old guy gets his shit rocked, then just know that it's been a long time coming. The last complaint was when he ran outside to the landlord screaming that something needed to be done about us because he heard our bed squeak the night before, and how dare he rent to some crazy college kids who are partying and having sex all night. The landlord finally told him to fuck off and stop being a bitter old man. Then the neighbor took a total 180 and we found out that he had decided to sue the landlord and was moving. Suddenly the neighbor kept offering us rides when one of us were walking. He stopped complaining and leaving notes, but our doorknob kept jiggling and turning it around midnight, and whenever we would check on our door we'd hear someone running down the hall as we'd approach our door. He eventually moved away, and shockingly we haven't gotten a complaint from any other neighbor in the last 3 years we've lived here. Lived in an apartment building with little better than paper for walls. You could clearly hear the next door neighbors' conversations, them having sex, walking up the stairs, etc. For some reason they thought it would be totally awesome to install a surround sound system and affix the speakers to our shared wall. It was not awesome. It was so loud that it literally shook the wall, and we couldn't hear our own television unless we turned it up ridiculously loud in return. The neighbors did not respond kindly to our request that they place the speakers elsewhere, or at least turn the bass down. It ultimately ended with cops being called on them after the guy got pissed at being asked again. to turn it down and started pounding on the wall and screaming about how he was going to fuck us up. They finally got evicted when he threatened someone at the management office on some other matter. Before he got evicted, though, we begged the office to let us move to a different apartment. Couldn't afford the lease breaking fee to just leave. And they did let us move to another building. And our new neighbors had a parrot that never shut the fuck up. And a special needs child who would literally spend hours banging on their piano screaming, singing. My name is Amanda. What can one do in that situation except grin and bear it? I guess. Once our lease was up, I was so fucking glad to leave that apartment complex. Some noise is expected in apartment buildings. I've certainly lived in other apartments and was fine with the normal, expected amount of noise. But when there's zero sound insulation and you have neighbors that don't give a shit, it sucks pretty bad. I rented a flat with an ex and the upstairs neighbor was an absolute nightmare. Deadbeat dad who had his kid every weekend and left them screaming all the time. He'd blast music until sunrise every day even when he had his kid. Got the council involved. Nothing happened. Got child services involved. Nothing happened. He used to argue every Sunday with his ex about how he wasn't paying child support. They'd argue right outside our door. We were on the ground floor. The guy was unemployed, owed the landlord a lot of money, and only left his flat to get groceries or drugs. He kicked off at me because my cat meowed loudly once. My neighbor once shot both my dogs and his goat and made me bury both. One dog survived thankfully. He then tried to make us pay for a new goat claiming that our dogs attacked it. The goat had bullet wounds and no bite marks. Had one that would basically steal our mail and other stuff from our porch and yard. Caught her once to confront her and she started yelling at me to stop attacking her and tried to say I was stealing her stuff. Ended up with the police getting called and us filing a restraining order against her. Edit. A word. I have a schizophrenic neighbor that has believed for years that I am hacking his electronic devices, scanning his phone, harassing, terrorizing him, etc. Over the years he has claimed I've held an old man hostage in my condo, allowed blood to drip from my patio to his, and that I'm a terrible racist. He leaves notes on the inside of his car accusing me of these things. I used to live in a house that was split into 2 apartments. My neighbors had the lower half, and I learned we had issues with the HVAC when their cigarette smoke came visibly pouring out our registers. Stank up everything we owned. Then one of them stole my car. Probably our neighbors in our apartment that just let their damn dog bark all day long on their porch. Like I don't think that dog is ever inside even during the winter until it's nighttime. It's so annoying. Oh, this is my moment to shine. I, 30F, lived in a multi-family home on the 2nd floor in a pretty wealthy town. Downstairs neighbor has been there for 12 years or so, a quiet single man in his early 60s with a dog. The first year or 2 I lived there, I had no issues with him. He was rarely home, didn't complain or cause any problems. My 3rd year living there I started to notice a young girl was staying at his place quite often. She was maybe my age, and I could tell they weren't related. I had no problem with him having guests, until the intense arguments started. Constant yelling and fighting, furniture being knocked over, etc. Then I notice this girl is staying over when my neighbor isn't home. And she's having people over. And they're also fighting and partying and just being obnoxious. I was in law school and the noise was not helping with my study schedule, so I was getting annoyed. One morning I hear an intense argument and doors slamming, so I look out the window and one of her Guests is trying to break into the house. I guess she locked him out. She eventually lets him in and they leave. Months go by of this weird shit going on downstairs and I started to feel unsafe. I ended up installing cameras in my apartment and at the front door that I shared with my neighbor. Camera catches random men coming to the house at all hours of the day to see this girl. Sometimes my neighbor is home and sometimes he's not. I thought she was selling drugs or something BC my neighbor was clearly using at this point. One day I go to get the mail and a court summons arrived in her name. I looked her up and she had a long criminal history. The noise and sketchy shit continues until one day she just disappears. For like 3 months. Life was back to normal. She eventually comes back and things get way worse. Come to find out she was in jail for prostitution. Great. I complained to my landlord enough times where he finally tells my neighbor this girl is no longer allowed there. Cops get involved and ban the girl from the house. Girl's gone but neighbor is still fucked up on drugs and just generally being a piece of shit. I come outside one morning to find a scratch on my car. We share a driveway and shit happens. No big deal. I let it go until a week later. I hear a crash in the driveway. Neighbor slammed his car into mine and crushed the entire front end. I go outside to confront him and he's so fucked up he doesn't realize he hit my car. I call insurance and go through the whole thing. The same fucking day. I came home from work and parked my already beat up car in a different spot so that he wouldn't hit it again. Like 11 p.m. that night. He crashes into my car again. Despite me moving it. And completely totals my car. I call the cops at this point because again, he's so fucked up and doesn't realize he hits it nor does he come to tell me. He backed out of the driveway going like 30 miles per hour and didn't realize he smashed my car to pieces? Okay. Anyway. I moved the fuck out the next week. His insurance paid for my car and I hope he got some goddamn help.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.